Hi everyone. According to many online sources, the son of Athrwys ap Meirig, a popular candidate for the historical King Arthur, was Morgan Winvau. Now this has some importance because Morgan Winvau appears in the Welsh Triads. He's said to have been one of the 3 red ravagers of the island of Britain. So that basically means he was an exceptional warrior who killed many of his enemies. So that shows that he was powerful. Now, if he was the same as Morgan, son of Athrwys ap Meirig, then that lends support to the theory that Athrwys ap Meirig was the historical King Arthur, because it would indicate that Morgan came from a powerful dynasty. Whereas if Morgan Winvau was not Morgan, son of Athrwys, then that would obviously weaken the evidence for Athrwys' dynasty being powerful. So what's the truth behind this mystery, this controversy? Well, what we know is that Morgan Winvau first appears in the Welsh Triads. Now the Welsh Triads are a bit difficult to date, but we can quite confidently say that they're pre-Geoffrey of Monmouth, most of them at least, including the reference to Morgan Mwynfawr. So pre-12th century, let's say. However, that reference to him doesn't say who he was the son of. It doesn't say anything about his family. So we can't use that reference to say who he was, whether he was the son of Athrwys or not. What is helpful though, is that there's a reference to him in Appendix 3 of the Welsh Triads, which generally speaking is talking about people from the 6th century, from the Arthurian period. So that lends strong support to the idea that Morgan Winvau was a figure from the Arthurian period. However, when we look further forward in history at the available records, things get a little bit more complex. So there are several manuscripts from the 16th century, or possibly even 1 or 2 from the early, or rather the late 15th century, which have Morgan Mwynfawr in the list of kings of Morgannwg, or in other words, Glamorgan. And Morgan, son of Athrwys, was one of the kings of Glamorgan. However, it's not that simple. This doesn't show that he was identified at that time as Morgan Mwynfawr. The problem is that these references to Morgan Mwynfawr actually apply this title to a much later Morgan, a Morgan who was around in probably the 10th century. So that doesn't seem to fit the other references from the Welsh Triads, which seem to place him in the Arthurian period. However, maybe the epithet Mwynfawr has simply been accidentally applied to this later Morgan, who was a descendant of the earlier Morgan, son of Athrwys. That's a possibility. However, there are also some records from the same general era, the 16th century, the early 16th century in fact, some versions of a genealogical record called The Descent of the Men of the North, which include Morgan Mwynfawr in the genealogy of one of the kings of the north. In fact, he's made the brother of a very famous king from the north of Britain called Rhyddarch Hael. So we have these 2 different claims from about the same era. Now it's difficult to put a precise date on these genealogical references, and even if we could, they're so close together around the early part of the 16th century or late 15th century that it's almost negligible, the difference. So they're about basically the same time. So we have these 2 conflicting claims, completely incompatible. How can we harmonize them? Or if we can't harmonize them, which one has the greatest weight? Now here's something which is very useful. When we look at the various manuscripts which talk about the genealogy of the kings of Southeast Wales, what we find is that some of them use Morgan Winvau in the same place as Morgan Mwynfawr from earlier records. One of them, for example, that you can see on the screen now, ABT 15E, seems to date from around about 1200. So this is decidedly earlier than the references to Morgan Mwynfawr. But you can see that these references to Morgan Winvau place him in the same position as Morgan Mwynfawr. So that's interesting because that indicates that Morgan Mwynfawr, Mwynfawr meaning the Great, could be used as an alternative form of Mwynfawr. Now that might be very useful. Can we find a Morgan Mwynfawr in the Arthurian period from earlier records? Well, as it happens, we can. There's a 14th century poem, or rather a poem which survives in a 14th century manuscript. So this predates these other manuscripts which refer to Morgan Mwynfawr in a genealogical context. So Morgan Mwynfawr appears in this Welsh poem called The Dialogue between Myrddin and his sister Gwynedd. Now this refers to a sequence of kings who appear to be the most predominant, powerful kings of the north of Britain in sequential order, although as Peter Bartram points out, for some reason this poem appears to present them in reverse chronological order. But anyway, the point is, this poem appears to present the sequence Urien Rheged, Morgan Mwynfawr, or Morgan the Great, and then Rhyddarch Hael. So that suggests that there was, between Urien Rheged, who was a powerful king who died in the 590s in the north of Britain, and Rhyddarch Hael, who died in the early 7th century, between them there was this Morgan Mwynfawr, or Morgan the Great. Now isn't that interesting? See, he fits chronologically with the tail end of the Arthurian period. Not that his actual career was necessarily concurrent with Arthur's, but he was from the Arthurian period, which fits his appearance in Appendix 3 of the Welsh Triads. So this fits chronologically. Morgan Mwynfawr, the king between Urien Rheged and Rhyddarch Hael, and the fact that he's presented as in the same category, the same level as Urien Rheged and Rhyddarch Hael shows that he was a very powerful, prominent king. And this also ties in very well with something that appears in the Historia Brittonum. In the Historia Brittonum, there's an account of the death of Urien, and he's said to have been killed by a certain Morgan. A Morgan who fought alongside Urien against the kings of the Angles, so he was a powerful, prominent ruler, but he became envious of Urien, so he then had him killed. So everything indicates that this Morgan mentioned in the Historia Brittonum was a powerful king who ruled after Urien Rheged. Well, his career obviously overlapped with Urien's, but he became the most prominent king of that area after Urien, so he fits in very perfectly with the sequence that we find in the dialogue of Myrddin and his sister. So everything indicates that Morgan Mwynfawr can be identified with the Morgan, the killer of Urien in the Historia Brittonum. And when we compare these genealogies which refer to Morgan Winvau and Morgan Mwynfawr, this appears to indicate that Morgan Mwynfawr was an alternative name for Morgan Mwynfawr. So that's what the evidence indicates so far, that Morgan Mwynfawr is the same as Morgan Mwynfawr, and he's the same as the Morgan who killed Urien in the Historia Brittonum. But who was he in terms of which dynasty did he come from? That's still an important question that we need to answer. Well, here's where this extra little detail from the dialogue of Myrddin and his sister becomes very relevant. Now, in that passage in the poem where Morgan Mwynfawr is mentioned, he is called the son of Sadurnin. Now that's a very useful bit of information, because the only Morgan who appears in any way, in any of the records, connected in some way to a figure whose name could have been presented as Sadurnin is Morgan, son of Athrwys ap Meirig. Now the reason is that in the Book of Llandaff, Morgan ap Athrwys ap Meirig appears as king in the witness lists in association with a certain abbot called Saturn. Now we know from other records that Saturn, in some Latin records, could be presented in some Welsh records as Sadurnin. This appears to have been an alternative spelling for the name Saturn or Saturnus. So the fact that Morgan ap Athrwys is the only Morgan who appears in association with someone with that name, who happens to be an abbot, which is a type of father figure, that's very, very significant. Now obviously this doesn't prove that Morgan ap Athrwys was Morgan Mwynfawr ap Sadurnin, But there's clearly no better case to be made. None of the other Morgans that we know of in the 6th century were in any way connected with anyone with a name like this. Morgan ap Athrwys is the only one who appears in the records associated with someone with this name. And like I said, he was an abbot, which is a type of father figure. It would be very easy to see how he could have been known in some traditions as the father of Morgan, especially because there's good evidence that Morgan was a very late son of Athrwys, and that Athrwys died during Morgan's childhood, so Morgan obviously must have had a guardian. Maybe it was the abbot Saturnus. But that's a subject for another video. The point is, since he's the only person, the only Morgan, connected with a person with this name, the evidence, as we have it, clearly supports the conclusion that Morgan Mwynfawr, who appears to be identifiable as Morgan Winvau, should be identified as Morgan ap Athrwys. So the traditional identification of Morgan Winvau as Morgan ap Athrwys isn't just the invention of Edward Williams or Iolo Morgannwg, as we often see in some sources, but it does genuinely have the weight of evidence behind it. It is genuinely the best supported conclusion based on the available evidence. Morgan ap Athrwys does indeed seem to have been Morgan Mwynfawr. Now, if you'd like to see a fascinating argument for the historical identity of the legendary King Belus, who was said to have conquered Cyprus with Teucer of the Greeks, then come back next time to see my next video about that.